Racial equity is sort of a broad umbrella term encompassing many different manifestations, many different strands. I'm going to provide a very brief overview of each of the sort of bulleted items and the different ways they manifest themselves in education, not just in North Carolina, but nationally. They are, of course, Keith has already addressed the resegregation of schools, and we need to be specific in saying this is not just public schools, but also in charter schools as well. The achievement gap, which is a phrase we've all heard of. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Discipline disparities, overrepresentation in special education, access to rigorous courses and programs, lack of diversity in teaching, and cultural competent education. As you can see, we're being pretty ambitious. So we in the Racial Equity Committee have our work cut out for us. So let us first begin with resegregation. We see here that by now we all know the landmark court case, Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education, which basically eliminated, at least in phrasing, a separate but equal way of doing things. We were told as a society to desegregate with deliberate speed. As Dr. Flood likes to say, most of us tended to lean more towards deliberation than speed. So it took us a while to get to the point where we actually reached some sort of semblance of desegregation. Progress, however, was made throughout the following years. Many court orders, however, have been lifted. You can see many of the pioneers, one of who is among us, actually, Dorothy Counts, so wanted to honor your presence here as well. But since that time period, those sanctioned court orders throughout the country, one by one, have fallen, and what we've noticed is a rapid resegregation of sorts in the school system. The only differences are, one is no longer state sanctioned in the sense that the state was not creating the segregation. This tends to be self-segregation by way of housing patterns. And two, double segregation, in that this is not just racial segregation we're talking about. We're also talking about socioeconomic segregation, so it tends to fall along socioeconomic lines as well, and in many places, those socioeconomic gaps in achievement are actually larger than the racial gap. So we're dealing with a mutated version kind of the same things, and we tend to see it more in the metro areas, but if you notice, even in some of the central cities, it tends to be a problem as well. This has become an issue that's been lifted. It's been gaining steam, ironically. Me being a teacher in Charlotte and only having been there for 5 years, I had a bit of a learning curve because obviously I learned that history, but I didn't know that Charlotte played such a central role. And North Carolina at large did, but Charlotte, of course, being cited in landmark court cases and then being one of these districts that are experiencing this segregation has led to the publishing of a book yesterday, today, and tomorrow, one of the authors being here. And then, of course, addressing the issue with Wake County and how Wake County managed to avoid some of those pitfalls, a famous book talking about why there are no bad schools in Raleigh. But the This American Life episode, which we will end up sending out to everybody here who is interested, with Nicole Hannah-Jones, did a piece talking about the resegregation of schools from a nationwide perspective. We've also been in contact with her, and she's agreed to work with us in the study group Racial Equity as well. But this is something that the tenor of which has been being raised very quickly. So, of course, for those that don't know, the landmark court case I was referring to is Swan versus CMS, 1971. And it basically set the blueprint for busing being used as a tool to desegregate. And so this is something that set in motion a nationwide trend of which Charlotte was at the center. And then Wake County in 2000 became one of the first public schools to become to implement class-based student assignment. So there has been some resistance to using race as part of the language for the desegregation. Wake demonstrated a commitment to still maintaining that diversity, finding ways to do things based more on socioeconomics. But since then, Charlotte has become resegregated to the point of nearing pre-Swan levels. And most recently, there was an article in the News and Observer talking about how even Wake, the isolated schools have doubled in their proportion recently. So similar trends can be seen in other counties. This is not exclusive to Charlotte or Wake. We see dissimilarity indexes increasing in Forsyth County. In Halifax, there is, of course, the 3 school districts and the entertainment of possibly merging those, and that may evolve into a suit of some sort. And they're also Pitt County with their desegregation orders coming down. There being concerns about whether that area will resegregate. So this is something that's rapidly evolving, different manifestations depending on where you're at throughout the state, but it is something of concern. So as I kind of already went through some of these things, but the point I really want to point out here is that isolated schools widen inequality. That's the reason why we're talking about this. It's not just because we think it's a bad idea. It actually impacts student achievement. There's plenty of evidence around that. And conversely, racial balancing of schools yields educational benefits. Despite some of the worst fears of students coming together, there are actually a lot of things that are yielded or gained as a result of folks from different backgrounds occupying the same space. And it becomes difficult to talk about providing students with a world-class education in classrooms that do not look like the world. There's something inherently contradictory about that. Interestingly enough, charter schools are not exempt. In fact, there has been research recently that charter schools may in fact be hyper-segregated. That is to say that although these are one of the options in the package of choice options, more often than not, people tend to gravitate to schools that look like their neighborhoods. So we have black students and families choosing to go to charter schools that are overwhelmingly black, and white families doing the same thing, so that it's even more polarizing. Then there's the achievement gap, the racial achievement gap, because there's a lot of achievement gaps, but we know that even now there's a difference between academic performance of students of color and their white counterparts. As you've seen from the history, there's always been an achievement gap. So this is something we've been dealing with for a long time, but it's a result of several compounding factors. The achievement gap is not merely that some students can or cannot achieve, but there are students that come to us as a result of policy, as a result of income, as a result of education of parents, several other factors that create a cumulative disadvantage for students before they even set foot in the classroom that impact achievement. And so our federal government, once upon a time, tried to respond to some of these things with equity-based reforms such as ESEA, to help mitigate it. But even that, as it's being reauthorized, some of the key elements that were meant to stave some of that off are not being included. So we made some gains at some points in time. The decades where we saw the greatest steps toward convergence, gap convergence, were in the 70s and the 80s. However, much of that has widened since. Many of those efforts have no longer had the same level of commitment. NAEP, National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is kind of like the nation's report card, continues to show racialized gaps in reading and math proficiency. These gaps can be seen not just in NAEP scores, but also everything from cohort graduation rates to even SAT scores. So we have much work to do. Just a little bit of North Carolina specific NAEP data, as you can see. And we should state that even the achievement of the highest subgroup, 55% on the NAEP for fourth graders who scored at proficient in reading, can we admit that that's a tragedy? That is an issue. But even the gaps between your African American, Hispanic, and white students, we see that those gaps continue to linger, so that is something we have to respond to. The same thing can be seen in eighth graders in math proficiency. These are dismal numbers that signal to us that this is a state of emergency in North Carolina and something we need to formulate an adequate response to. There are discipline disparities when it comes to suspensions and the way that infractions are handled at the school level. Nationally, students of color are disproportionately represented in suspensions and expulsions. This is a trend that's particularly pronounced in the South. There was a report released by the Center for the Study of Race and Equity in Education that took a look at that with the assistance of the DOE that showed in the South that this is something that overwhelmingly affects black males. In NC, black students are 4.2 times more likely to be suspended for the same offense as their white counterparts. So this shows us that perhaps there is a difference, or there needs to be a difference in the way that we respond, creating a policy that responds to that maintains equity or parity in the handling of these situations. These are not egregious offenses, by the way. These are not your, bringing a gun to school or making death threats, or these are things that are more discretionary, like insubordination, disruptive behavior. Think back to Antonio, that narrative that I gave you at the beginning. That kind of is representative of this fact. And so, consequently, because of suspensions and expulsions, many scholars have created a term called the school-to-prison pipeline. which basically means when you have students that are consistently being pushed out of school, they're being pushed into the criminal justice system, and the evidence does bear that out. Overrepresentation in special education. Once again, we see that these same populations are overrepresented in special education programs. Black students tend to be seen as having challenging behaviors and are there and usually labeled emotional disability. But this is not exclusive to just black students, because North Carolina has become progressively more diverse, especially with our Latino population. And even Native Americans receive services at twice the rate of the general population. ELL students are overrepresented in this as well. And it stands to reason that's probably the result of a language barrier, not representative of aptitude or skill level. Access to rigorous courses and programs. According to the Educational Trust, more than 500,000 low-income students and students of color are missing from AP and IB participation nationally. By missing, this means that they're simply not being offered the coursework. And many of us, especially maybe at the school level, know that it depends on where your students are at. But what research from the College Board has found is that this is not necessarily due to a lack of readiness. That some of this is just students not being seen. It's a perception thing that they're not capable of holding their weight in these classes, these rigorous courses, and also minority students being underrepresented in academically and intellectually gifted programs as well, something we want to respond to as a subcommittee. Lack of diversity in teaching. Students of color make up over half the public school population, yet teachers are just 18% of the teaching profession nationwide, teachers of color. And so if you have students who are overwhelmingly non-white, and then the constituents that are there to serve them do not reflect that population, that on its face may not seem like a problem, but it does tend to bear itself out in the achievement of the students. Every state have the same diversity gap. It leaves us with teachers who aren't representative, as I mentioned, and 84% of the teaching workforce in North Carolina is white. That is not necessarily a problem on its face, only in the sense that it does potentially impact, and the research says that it does, the achievement of students if they don't see themselves adequately represented. And there's some more data on that, with the benefits of all students benefiting from seeing somebody who doesn't necessarily look like them. It serves to alleviate stereotypes and cross-cultural communication. Lastly, culturally competent education. With increased diversity in the classrooms, ensuring cultural competence is paramount. Understanding and responding to, which is really the crux of culturally competent education, the environments from which students come from, is essential for good instruction. If teachers and administrators aren't culturally competent, it can negatively impact the students. Are teachers, no matter what they look like, being adequately prepared to step into a classroom where the constituency does not look like them, does not come from the same cultural background, have the same value sets, norms, etc.? Can they still instruct those students in a way that makes them feel included, that makes them feel worthy, and makes them feel understood? These are challenges within the Racial Equity Committee that we still have to respond to, and so hopefully those that are a part of that committee are developing solutions as we speak.